Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's summit titled Enterprise Best Practices for Azure AD and Active Directory. It's brought to you by the fine folks at Kaosoft, Imanami, Metallic, Jump Cloud, and Ativo Networks. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And during today's third session, we will be giving away a Nintendo Switch. You must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. Their underwriting this content lets us bring you this summit, so we thank them for their sponsorship and supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit. Top 10 Azure AD Active Directory Best Practices for 2022 and beyond. This session features Brian Posey, 20-time Microsoft MVP, technology writer, and a commercial astronaut candidate. Throughout his career, Brian has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and created numerous full-length video training courses and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of those blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his new Posey's Moonshot column. Brian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, David. Hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about best practices for Active Directory. And one of the things that's really going to make this unique is that even though I do a million of these sessions, they're typically limited to an hour. But today, for whatever reason, I was fortunate enough to get back-to-back sessions. So that means we're going to be going into a little bit more depth than normal. So I hope that you'll be able to stick around for the second one. So my first session is just going to focus on some general Active Directory and Azure AD best practices. And then the second one is going to be primarily related to security. Because interestingly, if you do a Google search on Active Directory best practices, the vast majority of the results that you'll get are security related, and rightly so. But that doesn't mean that other best practices are unimportant. So that's what this first session is all about, is just general Active Directory and Azure AD best practices. A lot of those have to do with structure. So I'll be getting into that sort of thing in just a moment. But before I get started, one thing that I do want to quickly mention is that Active Directory has been around absolutely forever. It was introduced way back in the days of Windows 2000. So you figure that was introduced in 99. So Active Directory is roughly 23 years old. And we even had the concept of a domain before that, dating all the way back to 1994 when Windows NT was introduced. So it's been around for a long time. And the reason why I mention all of that is because, as is the case with anything that has that kind of longevity, best practices change over time and they evolve. So the best practices that you might have been following a few years ago might not necessarily be best practices today. So I think that it's really important to periodically revisit best practices and just make sure that the practices that you're following in your own organization are still current. As a matter of fact, I hadn't really planned on talking about this, but just to give you a really ridiculous example, one of the early on Microsoft best practices for domains, and I believe this was in the days of Windows NT. I don't think Active Directory had actually come out yet, although this may pertain to the early days of Active Directory, but just a really ridiculous example, and this is a real Microsoft best practice. Back then, Microsoft recommended that you deploy 3 domain controllers for a domain. One is a primary domain controller, one is a backup domain controller in case the primary failed, and then a third one to just unplug and stick in a closet somewhere. In the event that you ended up having a massive problem with your domain, you could pull that out and use it to restore the other domain controllers. I kid you not. That would be considered absolutely ridiculous by today's standards. But the reason why I bring that up is just to illustrate the idea that Active Directory best practices can drastically change over time. And that's why it's so important to periodically revisit best practices. So let's go ahead and get into it. So this is 10 Active Directory and Azure AD best practices for this year and beyond. Starting with number 1, Active Directory structures matter. So in other words, the architecture of your Active Directory does play a role in how effective it's going to be. And there are any number of best practices that we can pull from for this. Now, incidentally, you'll notice that there's a URL at the bottom of the slide. And this URL points to a Microsoft Knowledge Base article. A lot of the best practices, not all of them, but a lot of the ones that I'm going to be discussing in this session were based on this particular TechNet article. So throughout this session and the next one, you'll see that I've provided sources wherever it's relevant. So getting into the Active Directory structure, as I'm sure you know, there are all kinds of different ways that you can structure your Active Directory with regard to forest and domain arrangements. Now, there is no definitive right or wrong way to do it that applies to every single situation out there. There just isn't. Every organization is different. Everybody has different needs. Everybody has different budgets. So you have to do what's right for your own organization based on your own logistical and budgetary requirements. Now, having said that, Microsoft does make one really important recommendation here, and that is that if you have a model where you've got a single forest but multiple domains, then Microsoft recommends using your root domain as a resource domain. Now, what is a resource domain? Well, the idea behind a resource domain is that it's a domain with no user accounts in it. And you use that domain for the sole purpose of protecting what is sometimes referred to as Tier 0, or I've also seen it referred to as Tier 1 resources, or essentially your domain's or your forest's most sensitive resources. I'm talking about things like Enterprise Certificate Authority servers. Oftentimes that's where group policy or ADFS is stored, and things like that. So in other words, put your most sensitive resources in a dedicated forest at the top of your Active Directory forest structure. Or excuse me, I think I said that wrong. Put your most sensitive resources in a dedicated domain, not forest, domain, at the top of your Active Directory forest structure. Now, just to give you a more concrete example of this, in my own environment, even though I'm a one-person shop, I actually adhere to this structure. So I don't want to give out too much information about my own specific environment, but just a quick overview of how it's set up. I have a resource domain at the top, and that resource domain contains Hyper-V hosts. It also contains a couple of System Center servers so that I can manage my environment. That's also where my DNS servers are at, and an Enterprise Certificate Authority. And then I have a production domain that falls below that. And then that production domain is where user accounts, groups, Azure AD Connect, my print server, and a couple of member servers and that sort of thing reside. So again, I'm isolating critical resources up in my resource domain where they're safely protected from my primary production domain. So that's just an example of how I do things in-house. So what else can we say about Active Directory structure? Well, another thing to consider is that if your organization spans multiple regions, then Microsoft recommends that you consider a separate domain for each region. Now, certainly you don't have to do this. As I said before, there are a million different ways to organize your domain structure. I've seen countless organizations that have used multiple domains within a single region, and that is perfectly fine if that's what works for you. But this is one of those Microsoft best practices, to use a separate domain or even domain structure for each region. So another best practice, though, is that if you do follow this and you are creating a separate domain in each region and that all falls within the same forest, then what you can do is you can take one domain controller from each region and put it in a different region. So that way you've got something to fall back on. So for the example that Microsoft gave is if you've got a U.S. region and you've got a European region, then take a domain controller from your U.S. region and stick it in the European region. So that domain controller that you put over there still functions for the U.S. region, but it does two things for you. One, if you happen to have an outage in the U.S. region, you've still got a functional domain controller because it's located elsewhere. The other thing that it does for you is that if you have users who travel between regions, then it makes it a little bit easier for that user to log on because there's a domain controller that's located in close proximity to where it is that user has traveled to. So just something to think about. So best practice number 2, Your site structure should mimic the real world. Now, this is a big one. As I said before, there's a lot of different ways that you can structure your Active Directory, but this one is, I guess I would say, about as close to an absolute as you can get. This is one of those best practices that I would very strongly recommend following. Again, there's no rule that says that you absolutely have to. It will work if you don't, but I'll show you an example in a moment of why it's important to do things in this way. So the idea here is that the sites that you define within the Active Directory and the subnets that you define in the Active Directory should mimic your physical network as closely as possible. And the same thing can also apply for virtual networks under the right circumstances. But just in the interest of not getting too far off on any tangent, I'm focusing primarily on physical infrastructure with regard to this discussion. So generally, when you create an Active Directory site, that site should represent a data center or an office or a branch office or some sort of physical location. Another best practice to follow is that every one of these sites that you connect should be connected to at least two other sites, the obvious exception being that if you've only got two sites, then they're connected to each other and there's nothing else to connect to. But the reason for this is that, let's say that you have a site that is only connected to one other site. Well, if something happens to that site link, then that site is completely cut off from everything else. And at that point, you're disrupting Active Directory replication traffic, you're disrupting cross-forest queries, and all sorts of things like that. So it's really important to have site links to at least two sites just for the sake of redundancy so that that traffic still has a path that it can take in the event that you have a failure on a site connector. So I mentioned a moment ago that I would give you an example of why it's important to define subnets in the Active Directory. Here's that example, and this came directly from Microsoft. This isn't something that I made up for the purposes of this presentation or anything like that. But this is kind of a thought exercise. So imagine for a moment that you've got a network and it spans multiple regions. And within the U.S., you have a couple of different IP ranges, but the main IP range for your U.S. region is 192.168.0.0/16. So you've got a 16-bit subnet in the 192.168 range. So then what you do is you create a matching subnet in the Active Directory. Now, for anybody who might not be familiar with that concept, when you create a subnet in the Active Directory, you're not actually creating a subnet on your network. You're only telling Active Directory, hey, this subnet exists on my network. That's all that does. So going along with this experiment that Microsoft had, let's suppose that there's no domain controller in this 192.168.0.0/16 subnet, but that subnet does contain a client. Now you go and create a brand new subnet at 192.168.5.0/24, and you create this on the network, but you don't tell Active Directory about it, so you're not creating that subnet in the Active Directory. And let's suppose that you also place a domain controller in the subnet, and let's also assume that both of these subnets are in the U.S. region. So now that client machine that I mentioned earlier, the one in the 192.168.0.0/16 subnet, let's suppose that that client needs to log on and they need a domain controller to process the logon request. Now, the domain controller that I just mentioned exists in the U.S. region just as the client does. So it would be easy to assume that that domain controller would be the one to authenticate that logon request. And it might be. But here's the problem. The Active Directory knows nothing about the subnet that domain controller exists in. Now, that doesn't mean that the domain controller is cut off. It still functions. But the Active Directory doesn't know what region that domain controller is in because it has no knowledge of that domain controller subnet. So at that point, when the client goes to authenticate, the Active Directory sees, okay, there's no domain controller in this particular subnet that the client is in, so I'll just pick one at random. Now, it might pick the one that's in the U.S. in that new subnet that was just created, or it might pick a domain controller that's somewhere across the world. So that's why it's so important to go ahead and define subnets in your Active Directory, is because doing that helps your clients communicate with domain controllers that's in close proximity to them. Now, one of the things that Microsoft recommends doing is to create a catch-all subnet to help avoid situations like the one that I just described. the idea behind a catch-all subnet is that you create this massive subnet that defines the entire region and covers the range of any subnet that could ever possibly be created in that region. So that way, if you forget to create a subnet, then Active Directory still has an idea of, hey, this domain controller is probably in the correct region, so that domain controller performs authentication and other services for clients in that particular region where the domain controller is located. Now, realistically, it's always way better to just go ahead and define subnets in the Active Directory and have those subnets match your physical network. That's a given. The catch-all subnet really only exists as a safety measure in the off chance that somebody forgets to define a subnet. In my own mind, I would personally rather just have the subnets listed in the Active Directory match what's on my physical network and not even worry about catch-all subnets. But as I said, catch-all subnets are just kind of there as a safety measure. It's up to you whether or not you use them, but that was listed among Microsoft's best practices as something to have. So, best practice number 3, pay attention to global catalogs. Now, at the very beginning of this presentation, I mentioned that best practices can evolve considerably over time, and this is one of those areas where best practices have indeed evolved over the years. So, for those who might not be familiar with a global catalog server, a global catalog is essentially a role within the Active Directory. There are 5 flexible single master operations roles, and some people think of global catalog as an unofficial 6th role because it does perform a critical service within the Active Directory, and not every domain controller is a global catalog server. But what a global catalog server does is it stores a complete copy of all of the objects in your Active Directory domain. And it stores a partial copy of all of the objects in the entire forest. So a global catalog is really important for cross-forest lookups. So anytime that you're searching for something that's in another domain, a global catalog server is involved in that search query that you're performing. So you can see that global catalogs perform a very essential service for the Active Directory. So what are some best practices? Well, every site has to have at least one global catalog. This is required just for basic Active Directory functionality. Now, when it comes to larger sites, there should be more than one global catalog servers. And as I mentioned, global catalog servers are heavily used for cross-forest lookups, and they're also used for cross-forest logons. So they perform a really essential role. Now, as I mentioned, best practices for global catalogs have changed because at one point, Microsoft's best practice was to use global catalogs sparingly. I'm paraphrasing here, but they discouraged against the creation of too many global catalog servers just because for every global catalog server, there's a certain amount of replication traffic that's involved. And there was a concern at that time that the replication traffic would overwhelm the network and that it would also increase the CPU utilization on domain controllers and basically deplete resources that were needed for other things. Well, the reason why this particular recommendation has changed over time is because hardware is more plentiful than it used to be. Our servers have far more CPU resources than they once did. Our networks are a lot faster than they used to be. So having that replication traffic really isn't as big a deal as it once was. So because of that, Microsoft's recommendations pertaining to global catalog servers have evolved. So just for basic functionality, every site has to have at least one global catalog server. And then for larger sites, Microsoft tells you that you need more than one. So one option is to make all of your domain controllers act as global catalog servers. That was once frowned upon, to say the least, but today it's perfectly acceptable to do that with a couple of caveats that I'll show you in just a second. One thing to note, though, is that if you do designate every one of your domain controllers as a global catalog server, then the operations master role is going, the infrastructure master operations role, that's one of those flexible single master operations roles that I mentioned a moment ago, that role is going to be suppressed. It's not really a big deal. It's just the way that Active Directory works, but it is something to be aware of. Now, if you dig a little bit deeper in Microsoft's best practices, you'll find the second paragraph on this slide that Microsoft is telling you that if you have a single domain forest, that you should go ahead and treat every domain controller in that domain as a global catalog server, and that's just the normal way of doing things. And because everything has to replicate among all of those domain controllers anyway, then designated all of those domain controllers as global catalog servers isn't going to produce any extra overhead beyond what was already being used. So no extra disk space is going to be required. You're not incurring any extra CPU usage or replication traffic. Everything will just work the same way that it normally would. So that's for a single domain forest. And that behavior is by design, by the way, according to this paragraph directly from Microsoft. So Microsoft's recommendations then go on to state that in most cases they recommend that you include the global catalog server role when you install a new domain controller. So anytime you set up a new domain controller, there's a little checkbox that you can select to designate that domain controller as a global catalog server. And according to this article from Microsoft, they're saying just go ahead and do it. Don't even worry about it. Make all your new domain controllers global catalog servers. But there are those two caveats that I mentioned a moment ago. So caveat number one is you don't want to do that if there's limited bandwidth connecting to that domain controller. Because remember what I said a moment ago about replication traffic. There is a certain amount of replication traffic that's generated by global catalog servers, particularly in multi-domain forests. So if you've got a domain controller in a location where there's a limited amount of bandwidth, maybe traffic has to traverse a slow WAN link, well then you don't want to be making that a global catalog server unless you're operating in a single domain environment. Because otherwise the replication traffic can take away from the available bandwidth and slow everything down. The other recommendation that Microsoft makes is not to place the global catalog on a domain controller that hosts the infrastructure operations master role in the domain unless all of the domain controllers in the domain are global catalog servers or the forest only has one domain. So if the forest only has one domain, you're good to go. You can make everything a global catalog server, no problem. If you've already made everything a global, if you've already made all of your domain controllers global catalog servers, no problem. That's good too. But if you've got some domain controllers that are global catalog servers and some that aren't, then you want to make really sure that whatever domain controller is hosting your infrastructure operations master role is not designated as global catalog. And to be totally honest with you, I'm not sure what the consequences of doing that are. So how can you decide whether or not a domain controller should be flagged as a global catalog server? Well, Microsoft actually provides this chart, and this is a direct copy-paste from the Microsoft website. This isn't my own chart or anything like that. But they create this tree to kind of help you through the process of determining whether or not it's appropriate to install the global catalog role on a given domain controller. So at the very top of the chart we have is any application that needs a global catalog server running at the location. Yes or no. If it's yes, then you want to go ahead and put a global catalog server at that location. If no, then we drop down to the next question. Is the number of users at the location greater than 100? If so, then yes, you're going to need a global catalog server at that location. If not, then we drop down to the next question. Is the WAN link 100% available? If it is, then you have to consider if the logon performance for roaming users is acceptable. And so then we make a decision based on that. And then we also consider, do many roaming users work at the location? And if the answer to that is yes, then you're going to want to have a global catalog server at that location. So let's move on to the next best practice. Best practice number 4 is OU design matters. And OU, for anybody who's not familiar with the term, refers to organizational units. That's one of the structural elements of the Active Directory. So there are a blue million ways that you can set up organizational unit design in the Active Directory. I've seen lots of creative organizational unit structures, and some of them seem to work really, really well, even though it's probably something that Microsoft never intended. Others, maybe they don't work out quite as well. But the way that you design your OU structure has an impact on the overall manageability of the Active Directory. So there are a lot of different ways that you can set up the OUs. And what a lot of organizations will do and what Microsoft seems to recommend in a lot of their documentation, and I don't know that this is a recommendation for every situation or anything like that, because I've never seen a Microsoft publication where they say you should always set up your OU structure in this particular way. But there are several documents that suggest that maybe this is their preferred way of doing things, if that makes sense. But what they recommend is setting up a multi-level OU design strategy that organizes the OU structure from general to specific. So what do I mean by that? Well, what that means is that you have a tree of OUs, and at the top of the tree, you have something really general, like the region. Maybe that's the U.S. region, maybe that's the European region, something like that. Then you create a sub-OU that's a little bit more specific, maybe a location within that region. For example, here we have on this slide, USA as the top level OU. Then beneath that, we have OUs for things like South Carolina or Kentucky. And then beneath that, we have departmental level OUs, in this case, IT and marketing. And then beneath that, we have OUs for users and computers. So why users and computers? Well, one of the best practices that I've encountered from time to time is that Microsoft recommends not putting users and computers into the same OU. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that per se, especially in smaller environments. In fact, that's the default Active Directory behavior, is to have users and computers in the same OU. But the reason why Microsoft recommends against putting users and computers into the same OU is that in larger organizations, there are often group policy settings that apply to users and other group policy settings that apply to computers. And by keeping users and computers separate in different OUs, it makes it a whole lot easier to manage those group policy settings. And it just makes everything a little bit more granular and easier to make changes and easier to manage your overall group policy structure. So one of the reasons why that's important is because in really large enterprise class environments, what you'll often end up with is you'll have more senior level people that manage the top tier OUs, maybe the regional OUs or the geographic location specific OUs, but then you'll have junior admins that are managing the lower level OUs. And if you separate things out to where it's really granular in the way that I showed you on that last slide, it makes it a whole lot easier to delegate permissions for an administrator to manage a specific OU or a specific element of an OU, such as users or computers. Now, another best practice with regard to organizational units is to make sure that they're protected against accidental deletion. Now, I'll be the first to admit that that one sounds really silly, but just stop for a moment and imagine the consequences if you or someone in your organization just made an errant mouse click and accidentally wiped out an entire organizational unit that contained thousands and thousands of Active Directory objects. And that's what you call a bad day right there. So it makes perfect sense that Microsoft would recommend as a best practice taking steps to prevent organizational units from being accidentally deleted. Now, the good news is that it's something really easy to do. So let me show you. I've actually got a couple of slides here with screen captures of what the process looks like. I'm not doing a lot of hands-on stuff in this presentation, but I wanted to go ahead and show you what this looks like because I think it's important. Now, when you create a new organizational unit using Active Directory users and computers, you're going to see a dialog box that looks like this. You provide the name of the organizational unit, and then there's a little checkbox just beneath that that you can select to protect the container from accidental deletion. It really is that simple. Now, what if you've got existing organizational units? Well, if those organizational units are relatively new, you're probably okay. But there was a time, and don't ask me what version of Windows this corresponded to because I don't know off the top of my head, but there was a time when protecting an organizational unit against accidental deletion wasn't a default behavior. So if your Active Directory structure has been in place for quite some time, you may have organizational units that aren't protected in this way. The good news is that you can relatively easily go in and check for that protection and turn it on if necessary. So the way that you would do that is by opening up Active Directory users and computers, and then you locate the organizational unit, just like what you see in the image on the left side of the slide. You right-click on that organizational unit, and then go down to Properties. And then when you select Properties, you're going to be taken to the organizational unit's property sheet, which you can see on the right side of the screen. So then you're going to select the Object tab at the top of the screen. You can see the blue arrow up top pointing to the Object tab. And then there's a checkbox on that tab, which is designated by the other blue arrow, and you just make sure that that checkbox is selected. Now, if you've got a really large and complicated Active Directory environment with lots and lots of OUs, there is a way to do this through PowerShell. So you can automate this entire process, so you don't have to go in and manually check every single organizational unit. Now, the PowerShell approach, that's a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation, but I wanted to at least mention that that is something that you can do if necessary. So moving right along, best practice number 5, domain controllers must have accurate clocks. And this is actually a really big one because your Active Directory will not function properly if the clocks aren't accurate. So there are a couple of reasons for this. The main reason is because the Active Directory uses Kerberos, and the Kerberos protocol is time sensitive. So if your clocks skew by more than plus or minus a few minutes, I think the limit is 5 minutes. I'd have to look that up. Kerberos breaks down, and that can cause all kinds of crazy things that you might not necessarily expect. So just to give you an example, quite some time ago, when Active Directory was still relatively new, I had an Exchange server, and I was having some problems with that Exchange server. I couldn't get it to work for anything. I was up all night just trying everything that I could think of, and everything seemed to be configured properly. All of the services were running. I couldn't find anything wrong with it, and yet nothing was working on this Exchange server. I even went so far as to restore backup. That didn't fix the problem. I even ended up reinstalling Exchange from scratch and then restoring just the mailboxes. That didn't work. And after a whole lot of digging, what I ended up finding out was that the clock on the Exchange server didn't match the clocks on my domain controllers. And that was causing Kerberos to break down, and that was causing Exchange to completely malfunction. So that's just one of the really crazy side effects that you can get from clock skew. Now, the good news is that clock skew isn't quite as common as it used to be, because Microsoft has since changed the design of the Active Directory so that the domain controllers act as an authoritative time source for all of the member servers. So whatever time is on your domain controller, your member servers are going to pick up on that and set their clocks accordingly. So that means time skew is not an issue at all, right? Well, not quite. I wish it were that easy, but it's not. There are still a few things that you have to consider. For one thing, if you have a large forest with domain controllers in different regions, you can end up with clock skew that way, where one domain has one time, one has another time. I don't think it's actually supposed to happen, but I've heard of at least a couple of cases where it has. Another thing is that you can end up with inconsistencies between the time on your domain controllers and times on network services that aren't connected to your domain. Maybe you use SaaS applications, and the clocks that are tied to those applications are a little bit different than what's on your domain controllers. You can end up with some really weird things, especially if you're using external databases that are located in separate forests. You can end up with transactions that actually happen before the clock on that server says that they happened. There's all kinds of weirdness. So the best practice here is to make sure that your domain controllers are tied to a network time server. That's an NTP server. Because that NTP server is an external resource. It's something that's not managed by your organization. It's managed independently, and that acts as an authoritative time source. So by connecting all of your domain controllers to that, that will ensure that they have accurate clocks, and then that accurate time will propagate out through the domain so that you have accurate clocks on everything else. Now, in order to do that, there are a couple of things that you're going to want to do. First of all, make sure that UDP port 123 is open on all of your domain controllers, because that UDP port is used by the network time protocol. Another thing that you're going to want to do is to go in and set a group policy to configure your domain controllers to get their time from that network time source. And the location that you go to for that is computer configuration / policies / administrative templates / system / Windows time service. So that's where you would go within the group policy hierarchy to set a policy to get the time from those external time services. Now, once you've done that, that change isn't going to take effect immediately. Typically, what you'll want to do is to open an elevated command prompt and do a GP update / force, and that will force the group policy to be reevaluated. and then that will point the domain controller to that time source that you've just entered in the group policy. But sometimes that may not necessarily work out immediately. For most group policy changes, it seems to work fine to just refresh the system using GP update. But I've tried that on some systems when I've made changes to group policy that point the domain controller toward an NTP server, and the clocks didn't change immediately. I'm not sure why that happens. But once you've done that, there is a way to force the clocks to synchronize to that network time server. And then once you've done that, everything seems good from then on out. The group policy does exactly what it's supposed to. So the way that you manually force a clock sync is to open up an elevated PowerShell window and then use the commands that are listed on this slide. So you would do netstop W32 time, so that shuts down the Windows time service. And then you do W32TM/config/ and then a bunch of flags to specify the time source that you need. Then use the netstart command to restart that service. And then you specify the W32TM command with the config and update flags. And then you do it again with the resync and rediscover flags. And that will force that machine's clock to synchronize to that authoritative time source. Now, that should bring all of your domain controller clocks into sync with an authoritative time source and make the time across your domain accurate. But there's one more thing that you have to consider before you do this, and that is the role of virtualization. Because obviously at one time, all of our domain controllers were physical, and everything I showed you on the previous slide would have been the only thing that you have to worry about. But virtualization adds an extra layer of complexity to things, particularly if you're using Hyper-V. And this may work the same way in VMware too. I just don't work with VMware often enough to really be able to tell you for sure. But in a Hyper-V environment, what normally happens is that you've got these integration services. And if you're not familiar with integration services in Hyper-V, they kind of act like device drivers for virtual machines. Some allow the guest operating system to interact with the virtual hardware. Others perform special functions for the virtual machine. And one of those functions is time synchronization. So what happens is when you virtualize a domain controller using Hyper-V, and you've got the time synchronization integration service enabled, which you can see on the right side of the slide what that looks like. When this is enabled, then the Hyper-V server ends up becoming the authoritative time source for the domain controller. So the virtualization host maintains the time. It passes its time to the domain controller, which the domain controller then propagates throughout the organization. So if the clock on the Hyper-V server is wrong, then you end up with an incorrect time on your domain controller. Now, if you've got that group policy in place and the domain controller is set to retrieve its time from an NTP server, but the clock on the Hyper-V server is wrong, then what you end up with is a situation where the Hyper-V server and the group policy within the domain controller are kind of fighting each other, and you may see the clocks ping-ponging back and forth once in a while. So the easy solution to that is to just go ahead and tie your Hyper-V servers to a network time protocol server, so that way they've got the same time as the domain controllers, and all of your clocks are consistent across the entire organization, guaranteed. So best practice number 6, there is a difference between object level and service level recovery in the Active Directory. So one of the best practices since the very beginning has been always back up your Active Directory domain. That's important. That hasn't changed. Where things get a little bit sticky, though, is when you have to do a recovery. There are 2 main types of recoveries that you can perform, and there's actually a third one that I'll talk about as the next best practice, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. The 2 main types of recoveries are object-level recovery and service-level recovery. Now, an object-level recovery is just what it sounds like. It's the recovery of an Active Directory object. Maybe it's a group, maybe it's a user, or some other Active Directory object. Now, as a best practice, you'll typically want to use the Active Directory recycle bin to do that object-level recovery. And if we're talking about Azure, then Azure Active Directory has its own recycle bin that you can use in a similar manner. Now, service-level recovery, on the other hand, is a situation where you're actually restoring the Active Directory from backup. And that's one of those things that you only want to do as a last resort. Now, if you have a domain controller failure, you don't need to worry about restoring that domain controller from backup. As a matter of fact, you shouldn't do that unless your Active Directory is just down completely. Because if you just have a domain controller failure, and you need to bring that domain controller back, there are other ways of accomplishing that are a lot less invasive. One is to just set everything back up and then let the normal Active Directory replication process populate the domain controller. That works in most situations. If that domain controller was holding one of those FSMO roles that I talked about earlier, then what you would want to do is assess whether or not there's any chance of that domain controller coming back on its own. If there's no chance of the domain controller being recovered without you intervening, then what you would do is go to another domain controller, and there's a command that you can run to seize that FSMO role from that failed domain controller and put it on another domain controller. Then once you've done that, you no longer have to worry about the FSMO role, and then you can simply remove that domain controller from the Active Directory domain, fix whatever needs to be fixed, bring it back, and then let the Active Directory replication process repopulate the Active Directory database on that failed domain controller. And then at that point, if you've got a need for putting the FSMO role back, you can do that as well. The point being that there's no need to restore the Active Directory database if all you're trying to do is to correct a failed domain controller. And as I mentioned a moment ago, an Active Directory restoration from backup should be an absolute last resort. That's one of those things that should only be done if you've suffered a catastrophic Active Directory failure and there's no other option. And incidentally, in case you're wondering why that's the case, restoring the entire Active Directory, that's not a simple undertaking, and there's a lot of, in most of the real-world situations that I've seen, there are unintended consequences to doing that. The operation tends to break things. So best practice number 7, back up your group policy objects. This is that third backup-related best practice that I mentioned a moment ago. Now, when you perform an Active Directory backup using your backup software, you are, of course, backing up your group policy objects as a part of that. But there's a separate way that you can back up your group policy objects so that they're maintained in XML format, and you can use those on an as-needed basis. So that way, if somebody makes a change to a group policy that shouldn't have happened and you need to quickly put that back, you can use that group policy backup that you've created to do that. Also, if you've got a group policy setting collection that you want to use as a model for maybe another domain or another forest or something like that, there's a way of using a group policy backup to do that. You can actually import those policy settings into another domain if need be. So the way that you would do that is by using the backup-gpo commandlet within PowerShell. And this is a really simple commandlet to use. There actually are several parameters that you can use with it, but at the very simplest, you would specify the name of the group policy that you want to back up by using the name parameter. In this case, I have test GPO as the name, but you would replace that with the name of the group policy. And then you would use the path parameter to specify the path where you want the backup to be written. And this can be a path on your hard drive, or it can be a UNC naming convention path. So you can point it to a file share. Another thing that you can do with this is you can use the -comment parameter and append a comment to the backup so that you know what the backup pertains to. And then one other thing that tends to be a little bit more useful than specifying manually specifying the name of a group policy is that you can use the -all switch in place of the -name switch. And when you use the -all switch, what that does is that tells Active Directory, or that tells PowerShell rather, that you want to back up all of the group policies that exist in the entire domain all at once, so you don't have to do them separately from one another. And I've provided a link at the bottom of the slide where you can go to Microsoft's documentation on how to do this. But it's a really simple operation, and I've actually got an article that's going to be coming out in my POSI's Tips and Tricks column on how to do this. So best practice number 8 is DNS is your Active Directory. So this is an important one because DNS is absolutely essential to Active Directory functionality. And if your DNS isn't healthy, your Active Directory isn't healthy. So you've got to make sure that your DNS it stays healthy and that it's functional and properly configured. Now, with regard to best practices, I could probably do an entire session on DNS best practices. But the one that I wanted to convey is that whenever you're setting up DNS in your Active Directory, well, two things. One, it's perfectly okay per Microsoft documentation to host DNS on your domain controller. As a matter of fact, there are quite a few Microsoft articles that recommend doing that. So, you'll see these best practices that say that you should never ever run any other services on a domain controller. Well, for the most part, that's true, but DNS is one of the big exceptions to that. It's totally okay to host DNS on a domain controller. The other best practice is that when you set up a DNS server for use with Active Directory, it's really important to use AD integrated DNS zones. And that makes all of your DNS servers writable. Now, will it work if you don't use AD integrated DNS zones? Yeah, it should. But as a best practice, you should be using those AD integrated DNS zones because that allows dynamic DNS updates to function properly. It will save you quite a bit of work in the long run. Another best practice, and I know I'm running a little bit short on time. I'm trying to pick up the pace so that I can take some questions here at the end. But another best practice related to DNS is that it's really important to avoid creating static DNS records if you can, particularly, and this is going to sound weird in the context of this presentation, but especially in a lab environment, because I couldn't even begin to tell you how many times I've set something up for an article, I've created a manual DNS record just trying to get something to work quickly, and then I've gone off and forgotten about that record, and then a couple months later I'll set something else up, and I totally forget about that DNS record, and what I'm setting up doesn't work. And after an hour or two of troubleshooting, I realize, oh yeah, I've got this DNS record that's left over from months ago, and that's causing the problem. So the best practice here is don't create static DNS records unless you have no other choice. Static DNS records should be the exception, not the rule. Best practice number 9, get a handle on old groups. This is one of those management best practices. The idea here being that over time, we all accumulate groups. And a lot of times, those groups can be temporary in nature. They serve a specific purpose, and then as time goes on, that group's no longer needed. But very often, the group ends up not being deleted. So Microsoft provides a way of automatically expiring groups that are no longer needed. But this only works in Azure AD. It doesn't work in on-premises Active Directory, to the best of my knowledge. So the way that you would do that is with a group expiration policy. So a group expiration policy requires you to have an Azure AD Premium subscription. And what it does is it allows a group to be automatically expired after a certain length of time unless the group is renewed. Now, this raises the question of what if you've got an admin who has tons of groups? They really don't want to spend all of their time renewing one group after another every time those groups start to expire. Well, there are some ways that groups can be automatically renewed. If Azure AD detects that a group is still being actively used, it will just renew it for you. You don't have to worry about it. But it's worth noting that Microsoft does make some very specific criteria for what it means for a group to be in use. Let's say you've got a group that's associated with SharePoint, for example. Just somebody going out and looking at a page in a SharePoint site isn't enough to cause that group associated with that site to automatically renew. If, on the other hand, the content within that site is being updated, maybe people are editing pages or uploading files or whatever, that would be enough that it would cause that group to renew. Incidentally, Microsoft also recommends using a group naming policy if possible. And what a group naming policy does is it standardizes the way that your groups are named by appending Active Directory attributes either before or after the group name. So that way you can use those Active Directory attributes to figure out who created the group or why or what department it's associated with and that sort of thing. So that way if you've got a group that down the road nobody can figure out why it exists, the name of the group can help you to figure it out. So best practice number 10, automated workflows are your friend. And the basic idea here is that in any organization, there are certain tasks that we perform over and over and over again related to the Active Directory. Maybe this is setting up a new user or deprovisioning a user account for a user who has left the company, or just cleaning up the Active Directory or creating various reports related to the Active Directory. Maybe you want a report of which users haven't logged on in the last 90 days or something like that. These are all things that automation can really help with. There are any number of tools out there that you can use to build workflows that will do these things for you, or you can do what I do and use PowerShell. PowerShell allows you to create some very effective scripts that you can do all kinds of things with. The reason why automation is key is because, one, it saves you time, But two, some of these involve a lot of steps, and if you're not using an automated workflow, it can be very easy to accidentally skip over a step and neglect something important. So use automation where you can, and it will help you to ultimately maintain a healthier Active Directory environment. So with that, I want to go ahead and leave a couple of minutes for questions here.
Okay, great job, Brian. And let's get to as many of those questions as we can. Brian, if you want to follow along, I'll have you take a stab at a very detailed question from John. He says, domain controllers are very chatty. If there is a DC at a site from another region, where should the logs be held? Considerations need to include bandwidth consideration and logging /SIEM/security tools. Do you have recommendations for full implementation of the DC other than just placing one at multiple domains?
Wow, that is a detailed question. As far as storing logs, I'm trying to think if there's a Microsoft best practice for that. I can't think of one off the top of my head that really fits that situation. One thing that I will say, though, is that when it comes to something as important as your logs, I'm a big believer in redundancy. So I would recommend having multiple copies of those logs wherever it is that you choose to store those. I realize that bandwidth is, of course, a consideration, as was said. But sometimes it's important to balance functionality with the bandwidth impact.
Okay, nice job addressing that question. Here's one from Daniel in the audience. This was early on when you were talking about spreading things around, I believe. He says, but I only have 2 sites. How can I connect to a third non-existing site?
Generally, if you only have 2 sites, you don't even have to worry about it. Just have a connector between those 2 sites and call it a day. If you're really worried about redundancy, then the best thing that I can recommend doing would be maybe go out to Azure and or the cloud provider of your choice, and just go ahead and set up a third site out there in the cloud, and then allow that cloud-based site to have connectors to your existing sites, and that would provide you a bit of redundancy. But given the cost and the licensing constraints, the licensing costs associated with doing that and the amount of overhead that would create, I'm not sure that I would go through all that trouble unless a potential site link failure is something that's really bothering you.
Okay. Here's a simple question from Tim in the audience. He asked, is principal account for apps in root?
Can you say that one more time?
Is the principal account for apps in root?
Is the principal account for apps a root?
In root. Is the principal account for your applications in the root directory, I guess?
Oh, I got you. I'm assuming that he means like service accounts for running applications. Is that something you would store in a root directory or in a user's directory? Or, excuse me, in a root domain or in one of the subdomains? I think that you would have to evaluate what makes the most sense for your own organization. The Microsoft best practices that I've seen for that state not to have any accounts at all except for the built-in admin account in the root. Personally, I think a case could probably be made for putting service accounts in the root as well, because those are things that you want to protect and probably isolate from your other user accounts. So, yeah, it's something I hadn't really given a lot of thought to before, but that may be a good idea.
Okay. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Brian, for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.
Absolutely.
Everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break, and Brian will be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, focusing on security best practices. So take a break, check out those resources on your console provided by our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course our sponsors, Kiosoft, Imanami, Metallic, JumpCloud, and the TiVo networks for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am here to moderate the second session of our Enterprise Best Practices for Azure AD Active Directory Summit, called Modern Azure AD Active Directory Security Best Practices. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey, a 20-time Microsoft MVP, technology writer, and commercial astronaut candidate. Brian Posey is a freelance technology author that has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and has created numerous full-length video training courses. He's also published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of those blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his new Posey's Moonshot column, both on redmondman.com. Take it away, Brian.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who attended that last session. I hope you all enjoyed it. And so in this session, I want to talk about Azure AD and Active Directory security. Now, Active Directory security is a huge topic, even if you don't bring Azure AD into the picture. Entire books have been written on the subject, and I'm pretty sure I've probably even written one of those along the way at some point in time. The thing is, there are so many best practices associated with Azure AD and Active Directory security because it is a massive topic. And so it's really tough to come up with a definitive set of best practices to cram into an hour-long presentation. So what I'm going to be doing in this presentation is just trying to give you a variety, because there are several primary areas that you need to focus on with regard to securing your Active Directory and Azure AD environments. And so I'm going to try to pull a few best practices from each one of these different areas. So that's my plan for this presentation. Now, one of the things that I want to begin with is by talking about some of the types of attacks that occur against Active Directory, because it's really tough to talk about security unless you first know what the threats are that you're trying to secure against. Makes sense, right? So when it comes to attacks against your Active Directory, there are really two main types. And the terms that I'll use for this, and these are my own terms, I'm not sure that they're necessarily industry-specific terms, although they may be. But the two main types of attacks are what I like to call checklist attacks and graph attacks. And it's important to defend against both. Now, a checklist attack is typically an attack that involves exploiting a known vulnerability. And as IT pros, we've gotten really good at defending against this type of attack, because we've all seen those articles out there, and I've probably even written some of these, I'm sure I'm guilty of this, where it'll say, hey, do these 10 things to secure your Active Directory, and boy, are you going to be secure. That's the basis of a checklist attack. The attacker has the same type of checklist. Generally, it's something very similar to what you would use in a pen test or a penetration test, and the attacker just goes down the list. Have they secured against this vulnerability? Yes. Okay, what about this next one? Have they secured against that? No. Okay, well, we'll use that one to try to get in. So a checklist attack is exactly what it sounds like. The attacker is following a checklist of known vulnerabilities and finding out which vulnerabilities are still present on a system and which have been secured against. A graph-based attack is a little bit different, and this is one of those things that tend to get neglected by a lot of organizations. A graph-based attack is an attack in which an attacker has a starting point, and they have an endpoint objective that they're trying to achieve. And so they formulate an attack not by going through a checklist of vulnerabilities, but rather by looking at what steps would be required from where they're at now to help them to achieve that desired objective. Now, admittedly, there is some overlap between the two types of attacks. An attacker might use a checklist attack to initially penetrate the organization and then transition into a graph-based attack once they've made their way in. So there is some overlap. The two aren't completely separate from one another, but those are the two main types of attacks that you're going to have to defend against. So when we talk about hardening the Active Directory or your Azure AD environment, these are the two types of attacks that you need to be thinking about with regard to your strategy. So one of the first questions that you have to consider with regard to hardening your Active Directory and Azure AD environments is, what is the attacker's initial point of entry going to be? So regardless of which type of attack the attacker is going to use, they're going to have to initially breach your organization somehow. So how are they going to get in? Well, there are any number of ways that an attacker could potentially get in. The slide lists some of the more common ones. Outdated malware protection is a big one. New malware comes out every single day, and oftentimes a malware infestation will be designed to download some other component, and that component might allow backdoor entry into an organization, and that might act as an attacker's initial point of entry. Also, outdated patches, that's a really big one, because how many vulnerabilities have you seen that potentially allow for remote code execution? The attackers know this, and they also know that if you haven't applied a patch for that particular vulnerability, then they may be able to find a way to exploit that vulnerability and go in and execute code on your system. Also, disabled security features. This is another big one. At one time in IT, it was relatively common for IT pros to say, okay, I just cannot get this particular feature to work right, but if I go in and I turn this security feature off, lo and behold, it works, and everybody's happy because now this thing that everybody was asking me for suddenly works. And, I've seen that in the real world more times than I really care to admit. But this is one of those things that we just really can't afford to be doing anymore because the stakes are so much higher than they used to be. So disabling security features can lead to this initial entry that will allow for an attack to progress. Also, outdated applications. A lot of applications, just like operating systems, need to be patched, but that's not the only way that an application can be outdated is missing patches. An application can also be outdated if it's an older application that relies on older techniques such as legacy authentication. That's a big one. So look for outdated applications that can potentially contain a vulnerability that would allow an attacker to gain the initial entry into your system. And then another big one is excessive permissions. Now, there's been so much material written about excessive permissions, particularly with regard to zero trust and the idea of least user access and role-based access control and that sort of thing. But there's one important point that a lot of people miss with regard to excessive permissions, and that is this. Think about how long the Active Directory has been around. And I alluded to this a little bit in the first session, so I won't go into this in too much depth, but Active Directory was introduced with Windows 2000 way back in '99. And the concept of a domain has been around since Windows NT Server, dating back to 1994. So imagine for a moment that somebody implemented an Active Directory environment, a domain environment back in '94, and then they migrated to Windows 2000 at some point, and then over the years they migrated to newer and newer versions of Windows until we get to the point where we are today with domain controllers running on Windows Server 2022. That's great, but the problem with that is that all of those successive migrations that have happened over the years never really did away with the original structure. Sure, structural changes may have occurred, new Active Directory objects have been created, maybe some old ones have been deleted, but there's a really good chance that there are elements of that original domain structure that dates back decades that are still in place. So why is this so important? Well, if you really stop and think about it, if somebody put something into place at the time when a domain was first established, maybe they didn't fully understand the concept of a domain, or they didn't understand the implications of some of the configuration actions that they were taking. Well, that bad configuration decision that was made decades ago may have propagated over the years through one migration after another, and still be in place today. And oftentimes what you'll find is that that's tied to excessive permissions. Maybe there was a group that decades ago was given more permissions than it should have been, and that's still around today. So it's a good idea to dig into your Active Directory and take a really hard look at the permissions that are given to users and groups and just see if there's anything there that shouldn't be there. That's one of the most effective things that you can do to guard against an attacker making an initial point of entry. Now, when we start talking about Active Directory security, one of the things that I would recommend doing is taking a look at Secure Score and Identity Score, particularly if you're operating in the cloud. Now, these aren't new. They're things I've talked about a million times in different webcasts that I've done on this platform, but I keep mentioning them because they're important. So Secure Score is an element of Microsoft 365, which runs on Azure AD. So what it does is it takes a look at the way that your environment is configured, and it gives you a numerical score. And that score is a reflection of a percentage, or it's expressed as a percentage that is a reflection of points accumulated by performing certain security objectives. Here's what it looks like for anybody who may not have seen it. So in this case, the secure score is 18.65%, meaning that this particular environment could be a whole lot more secure than it really is. And you can see a comparison of your score compared to other organizations that are like yours. So you can kind of get a sense for where everybody else is at in terms of security, and if the way that your environment is secured is really out of whack compared to everybody else's. And there are also improvement actions that you can take to get your score up. So if you look toward the center of the screen near the bottom, you can see that we have top improvement actions. And Microsoft lists all these steps that you can take to improve the security of the environment. So for each one of these improvement actions, we have the action itself. In other words, what is it that you should be doing to improve your security? Then you can see a percentage next to that, and that's how much your score is going to increase by if you perform this particular action. Then you have status. So is this something that you've chosen to address? Is it something that you've decided to just accept the risk and not do? That's reflected in the status. And then you have a category. And in these cases, most of these improvement actions are tied to identity, although the one at the bottom is tied to apps. So that's just a really quick breakdown of Secure Score. Now, in addition to Secure Score, there's something called Identity Score. And Identity Score is tied more specifically to Azure AD. Now, the reason why Identity Score is so important is because a lot of people have suggested, this isn't something that I made up, other people deserve credit for this, that identity is the new perimeter. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you think about the way that security has always been handled in the past, security was tied to the network perimeter. In other words, there was a time, and granted it's been a while, although not really that long, but there was a time when we all had data centers and offices, and the way of thinking was that if you can keep the bad guys from coming into your four walls, and if you can keep users from sending anything sensitive outside of your four walls, then you're doing great. Everything's secure. You got nothing to worry about. That was the general way of thinking at the time. Now today, of course, that's absolutely ridiculous. That would never work. Because think about the way that things have changed. Whereas all of our applications used to be contained in the data center, now they're all scattered across a gazillion different clouds. We might still have some applications running in our data centers, but we might have other applications in Azure or on the Amazon cloud or who knows where else. We might subscribe to SaaS applications. So our data is no longer exclusively contained in our data center. Likewise, end users are no longer in the office, working from carefully curated domain-joined corporate desktops. Instead, they're largely working from home or other remote locations, and very often from personal devices. So the whole idea about defending the perimeter just doesn't even work anymore, because the perimeter is more or less non-existent. Everything is too widely scattered. So the idea behind identity being the new perimeter is that since we can't focus on securing the perimeter anymore, the next logical step is to work around securing user identities. So we've all got accounts, and those accounts are a favorite target of attackers because those accounts have permissions associated with them. So the best thing that you can do to protect your Active Directory environment is to secure those identities and those accounts that correspond to those identities. So getting back to the slide, this is where Azure AD comes into play. So as you can see, I'm in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, and there are two great big blue arrows on the slide. The top one is pointing to Azure Active Directory, so we go to that tab. And then the bottom blue arrow points to an option in the Manage section for Identity Secure Score. And when you click on that, you're taken to a screen that looks like this. And this is very, very similar to what I showed you a moment ago with the General Secure Score, but there are a couple of differences. This one is specific to identity, whereas the General Secure Score that I showed you a moment ago is more about keeping your Microsoft 365 environment secure. I went ahead and threw that in because Microsoft 365 does run on Azure AD, but this particular chart is specific to identity security. Now, if you look at the improvement actions, the one thing that I wanted to show you, besides the fact that some of the improvement actions that are listed are different from what you saw with the Secure Score screen, the very last column is implementation cost. The reason why that column exists is because a lot of the security mechanisms that exist for Azure AD require an Azure AD Premium subscription. So you're not necessarily going to be able to take all of the recommended actions if all you have is a basic Azure AD subscription. You may find that it's worthwhile to upgrade to one of the premium subscriptions if you want to take full advantage of all this. Now, another thing that I'll quickly mention before I move on is that whether we're talking about the Identity Secure Score or just the basic secure score that you get with Microsoft 365, it isn't necessarily realistic or even desirable to try to reach a score of 100%. Because every organization is different. We all have unique concerns, unique requirements. So a security setting that is appropriate for one organization might be totally disruptive for another organization, and it could even be detrimental to that organization's ability to function and for users to do their jobs. So you have to balance security with functionality. I've got a friend who used to say that if you want to make your data completely secure, then what you do is you unplug the server, stick it in a safe, and drop the safe to the bottom of the ocean. At that point, it's secure. Nobody's going to get to your data. But the data is not accessible at all, nor is it usable at that point. So it would kind of be a ridiculous thing to use if you care about your data. So the point being that you've got to balance functionality with security and do what's right for your own organization. So you don't want to be putting in security policies that make it impossible for users to do their job, especially if you're only implementing that policy in the interest of getting your score up. Now, as I was putting this presentation together, I was looking at several different statistics, and I found one from Microsoft, and you can see the source at the bottom of the slide. And this particular statistic said that, according to Microsoft, 97% of breaches were avoidable through simple or intermediate controls. 97%. Now, this report was a couple years old, but I'm assuming that the basic premise of this is still valid. You know, maybe the numbers changed by a percentage point or two in one direction or the other. But the point remains that a huge percentage of security problems can be avoided just by using the controls that are already at your disposal. So that's a really big key takeaway when it comes to securing your Active Directory environment, is to make sure that you're making use of the tools that are available to you. You know, a lot of organizations will go in and set everything up and just kind of do the basics, but they're not as secure as they could be because there are security features that exist within Windows Server that maybe they haven't turned on or configured. Now, one of Microsoft's really big recommendations, and one of the first things that I would recommend to anybody who's concerned about Active Directory security, is to enable multi-factor authentication. And there was an article from Microsoft. Again, I've provided a link at the bottom of the slide if anyone wants to check this out. And according to this article, which was a couple of years old, at that time, there were over 300 million fraudulent sign-in attempts to the Microsoft Cloud every single day. And Microsoft went on to say that multi-factor authentication could block 99.9% of account compromise attacks. So 300 million per day. Think about that for a moment. This was a couple of years ago, but that's 300 million attacks every single day just on the Microsoft Cloud. That's not even counting attacks against on-premises environments or other clouds or SaaS applications or things like that. This is just attacks targeted at things like Azure and Microsoft 365. And the number's probably gone up since then. And just to put that number into context, 300 million, that was roughly the population of the United States at that time. So you figure, like, every single person in the country making an attack against Azure AD every single day, that's roughly the scope of what we're talking about here. And Microsoft was saying that multi-factor authentication can block almost all of those attacks. So whether you believe that statistic or not, I do think that it underscores the idea that multi-factor authentication is one of the most effective things that you can use for keeping your identity secure. Now, in some organizations, there are logistical issues that prevent the use of multi-factor authentication. I get that. And there's even a slide on that a little bit later on in the presentation if I make it that far. So what I would suggest is if you're not able to implement multi-factor authentication across the board, do it where you can. At the very least, make sure that any privileged accounts are secured by multi-factor authentication. And then if you've got some users that use an application that simply can't work with multi-factor authentication, turn multi-factor authentication on for everybody else. Just, let those users who can't use it continue to use legacy authentication, but transition everybody else to using multi-factor authentication. Some security is better than no security. So here are some more statistics from Microsoft from that page that I mentioned a moment ago. So I'll just quickly go over some of these. At the time, and this was in 2019, so this is a couple years old, but Microsoft was saying that every day they were seeing 4,000 ransomware attacks, 300 million fraudulent sign-in attacks, and 167 million daily malware attacks. And then they went on to say that 81% of breaches are caused by credential theft, which 81%, that's a big percentage, so that's something that is hard to ignore. So protecting against credential theft is obviously something really important that you should be doing in your organization. They go on to say that 73% of the passwords that are being used are duplicates. So what that refers to is maybe a user who is forced to change the password that they use to log into their network, and they use that same password on their social media accounts or their Amazon account or whatever else, just because they've got so many passwords that they have to remember, so they use the same password for multiple sites. That's what it means by password duplicates, and that's obviously something that you want to avoid at all costs. Also, 50% of employees use apps that aren't approved by the enterprise. So if you got an unsanctioned application that a user is using, that application can contain vulnerabilities that an attacker could potentially exploit to gain access to anything that that user has access to. So that's something else that I'm going to be talking a little bit about as I go on. Now, when it comes to multi-factor authentication, I think that it's really important to talk about balance. I mentioned a moment ago the example about taking your data, sticking it in a safe, and dropping it to the bottom of the ocean being wildly impractical. Well, this is one of those examples where you have to balance security with practicality, because nobody wants to have to complete a multi-factor authentication prompt every single time that they log in or try to access a particular resource or something like that. Nobody wants to be pestered by constant, okay, if a code is being sent to your phone, you got to enter this code, and it's a pain. Nobody wants to deal with that. So what you can do is you can limit the number of multi-factor authentication prompts that your users receive. And Microsoft provides a mechanism within Azure AD that you can use to do that. Now, there are two options that you need to be aware of. The first one is the option to stay signed in. You can see what that looks like on the screen right there. And that's something that even if you haven't necessarily turned that on in Azure AD, your users may periodically see this prompt. They'll log in to maybe Microsoft 365 or something like that, and they'll see a prompt like this one asking them if they want to stay signed in, and that will reduce the number of times that they're prompted to enter a password. That's a great convenience feature for end users, assuming that they're working from a trusted device. Now, the other option is an option to remember multi-factor authentication for X number of days, and as an admin, you can tell Azure AD how many days that is. So what that means is that, let's say that you've required multi-factor authentication in your organization. A user logs onto their device, they complete the multi-factor authentication challenge, and at that point, Windows knows, okay, they're working from this particular device. They've already completed multi-factor authentication. If they log in an hour from now on the same device using the same account, they're probably who they claim to be. So there's really no reason to make them complete this multi-factor authentication challenge again. So you can set it up so that Windows doesn't ask for them to complete that multi-factor authentication every single time that they log in. You can set it so that that's valid for so many days, assuming that they're working from the same device. Now, one thing that I do want to quickly mention about this is that these options are mutually exclusive. You can either use the stay signed in option or you can use the remember multi-factor authentication option, but you can't use them both at the same time. They'll interfere with one another. So there's a link at the bottom of the slide to a page that you can go to learn more if you're curious about this sort of thing. Now, another important thing that you can do with regard to keeping your Active Directory environment secure is to make sure that you're auditing the Active Directory and reviewing the audit logs. So this is one of those things that's really important, but it's often neglected. Now, according to Microsoft, 85% of security incidents that occurred took weeks or even longer to discover. And of those incidents, 92% were discovered by a third party. So what that really means is that an organization has a security incident and they don't even know about it. But a few weeks later, they've got a consultant or somebody coming in doing some IT work for them, and that consultant just happens to look at something in the logs and finds that incident that occurred that the organization totally missed. And according to these statistics, it would suggest that this is something that's super common. So definitely worth paying attention to. And then Microsoft goes on to say that investigators noted that 66% of victims had sufficient evidence available within their logs to discover the breach had they been more diligent in analyzing the resources. So I just wanted to put this out there because it's really important not just to make sure that you're logging Active Directory activity, but also taking the time to analyze those logs. And you don't have to do it manually. There are many tools out there that can perform log file aggregation and search your logs for anything that might signal that an attack is happening or that a breach has occurred. So you've got the evidence in the log files, and it's important that you use that information. Now, another thing that you can and should be doing is to train your users. Because really, at the end of the day, your users are probably your biggest security vulnerability. Because remember, whatever size organization you've got, whether you've got 10 people or 10,000 people, you've got users. Those users have certain permissions associated with their accounts. And each one of those users has the potential to inflict at least some level of damage to the organization if they do something dumb, such as falling for a phishing attack or unleashing ransomware or something like that. That's a perfect argument for implementing least privilege access and zero trust, but it's also an important argument for educating your users on what they should and should not be doing online. So it's really important to establish a culture of security awareness. Initially, this means using strong passwords, taking steps to protect the devices that the users are working from to the best that you can. That can be a bit tricky if users are working from personal devices, but do what you can. And then enabling security features wherever you can do that. Now, another thing that you can do if you happen to be using Microsoft 365 is attack simulation training. I don't want to go into this in too much depth because there's a lot of other things that I want to cover, and I'm not sure I'm going to have time to get to all of them. But the idea behind attack simulation training is that Microsoft 365 has a built-in tool that you can use to launch a simulated phishing attack against your users. And the simulated phishing attack is designed to look completely real and to mimic real-world phishing attacks in pretty much every way, just to see who falls for it. And if a user does fall for it, then you can show them what they've done wrong, what the telltale signs was that this message that they fell for wasn't legit. And you can even require training for the users who fell for that attack. So let me just show you a couple of screen captures in case you've never seen this before, and you can see what this looks like. So here we are signed into Microsoft 365 in one of the administrative consoles, and the console asks you what type of phishing attack you want to perform. Now on this screen, credential harvest is the only option that's highlighted. The others are grayed out. And the reason for that is that the options that are available to you vary depending on your subscription level. In my case, I've got an Enterprise E3 subscription, so credential harvesting attacks are the only option that I have. So when you select the attack, you're taken to the Select Payload screen. And the idea behind this screen is that there are a number of different phishing messages that you can choose from, and these messages vary by type. So right now, I've selected a security upgrade message, and you can see a sample of what such a message would look like. So we have a message with a body that says something like, recent server update, kindly update to the latest security update to enhance your email functionality. Update now, be aware Office 365 will not be responsible for any loss of data should this warning be neglected. So that's what the phishing message looks like, and the message would obviously differ if you were to choose a different payload. So you send it out, you choose who you want the message sent to, and then when a user gets the message, if they open it and they click on the link in the message, they're going to see a message kind of like this saying, it's okay, you're human, let's learn from this. And then it goes on to say, hey, you were just phished, but rather than stealing your credentials, let's take a look at what you could have done different. So then you get taken to this screen, and it actually steps the user through various parts of the message that show them that, hey, this was probably a phishing attack rather than a legitimate email. So it gives them some things to look for in future emails. And because there are so many different messages that you can choose from, you can periodically go back and launch new phishing attacks against your users to see if they've learned anything from the previous ones. And if a user does indeed fall for a phishing attack, then you have the ability to require them to take some training. And these training modules are really short and simple. you can see that this one says that it should take 3 minutes. In reality, it's probably more like 30 seconds. But here's an example of what that training looks like. Microsoft 365 will present a situation and then ask the user, what do you think that they should do? And then they answer a multiple choice question. And then the software will tell them why or why not their choice was the best one. So one of the really important things that I wanted to talk about is that we hear a lot in this day and age about phishing attacks and all of the horrible things that happen as a result of phishing attacks. You know, phishing attacks can lead to anything from credential theft to ransomware infections and much, much more. But there is one other type of attack that comparatively few people talk about, and that is QR code-based attacks. And this is one of those things that, even though it's not receiving a lot of attention, these attacks can be absolutely devastating. And they're so simple for an attacker to pull off. All they have to do is replace a legitimate QR code with a malicious one that's designed to perform some sort of unwanted activity. And then when someone scans one of these QR codes, then they end up falling victim to the attack. So I wanted to talk about that because these types of attacks, even though they're directed at consumers and their mobile devices, if someone uses that particular mobile device for work, then a QR code attack could end up impacting your Active Directory environment, even though this isn't directly related to the Active Directory. So let's take a look at what this looks like. What I've got on screen right now is a QR code generator, and there are a million of these. I just picked one at random off the internet and opened it up. So what this does is it allows you to generate a QR code for a specific purpose. In this case, I picked the URL option, and then I specified a URL, and the software generated a QR code that would direct the device to go to that URL. Now, in this case, I just pointed it to my own website, but you can only imagine what an attacker would do. They could create a QR code that leads to a malicious URL that would cause ransomware to be downloaded to a device. So that's one example. You can also create QR codes that will automatically launch or send a tweet, or make a Bitcoin payment, or download something from the App Store, or send a text message, or send an email message. There are all kinds of things that you can do with QR codes. So you can imagine how devastating these codes could be in the wrong hands. Now, one of the things that makes QR codes so problematic is that, unlike an email message, QR codes aren't human readable. So if us as IT pros receive a phishing message, there are certain things that we look for right away and realize, hey, this is a phishing message. I'm not clicking on anything. QR codes are a different story because take a look at that QR code on the screen. I can't read that. I'm assuming you probably can't either. So just to look at that, there's no way of knowing if that's malicious or if that's legitimate. That's why QR code attacks are such a problem. So what can you do about it? Well, the first thing is to just accept the idea that users work from personal devices and that QR code attacks are real and that they do happen. Unfortunately, it's one of the sad truths of life. Another thing that you can do is to make sure that any user who is working from a personal device to do work stuff, make sure that there is a certain minimum amount of security software that's installed on that device. Protect the device to the best of your ability. Now, that's not always easy if the user is working from a personal device because there are device sovereignty issues that come into play. There are also licensing issues that may come into play. But if you can pull off getting security software installed on the device that will protect against device takeover attacks and that sort of thing, then that will only help you. And that would be one of my number one recommendations. Another thing, require multi-factor authentication. Because again, if a user scans a malicious QR code and that QR code attempts to do something bad, then if you're requiring multi-factor authentication, that might be the one thing that puts a stop to that attack. Also, work toward implementing passwordless authentication. Use a multi-factor authentication for now, but take advantage of authentication options that aren't based around passwords. Right now, you can't use passwordless authentication for absolutely everything, but there are things that you can use it for. So start adopting that technology wherever you can. So another best practice, getting back more into the Active Directory side of things, is to make sure that you use dedicated admin accounts. So this is another important one. From a convenience standpoint, it's usually a lot easier just to use one account for everything. But from a security standpoint, that's a terrible practice, because if your account is taken over, then whatever permissions your account has, that's the permissions that the attacker has. So you really don't want to be using a privileged account for anything that doesn't require privileges, because you want to minimize the chances that that account will ever be compromised. So in smaller organizations, that might mean creating 2 separate accounts for each administrator, one with privileges, one without. In larger, more sophisticated organizations, that might mean using one account for each administrator, but using something like PIM or Privileged ID Management, so that those privileges are delivered when they're needed, but the rest of the time that admin is treated as a standard user. Also, if an admin is logged in using a privileged account, make sure that those accounts are set up for multi-factor authentication, and also make sure that before the admin signs out, close out any browser sessions, log out of anything that may be open, and just make sure and close any browsers before switching from one account to the next. So another important thing to protect your Active Directory environment is to do what you can to protect the organization against malware. So what can you do there? Well, the really obvious thing is blocking or using anti-malware software. But beyond that, there are attachment types that should be blocked within inbound and outbound email messages. So that way, if somebody emails you an executable file, you can just block that before anybody has the chance to click on it and do something bad to your organization. Another recommendation would be don't disable Microsoft Defender. I've seen lots of people that have gone in and turned off Microsoft Defender inside of Windows because they consider it to be ineffective or because they've got other anti-malware software. I would say if the anti-malware software that you're installing doesn't disable Defender, then you probably shouldn't manually disable it, because Defender is one of those things that hasn't really saved me from a lot of situations over the years, but every once in a while I have seen it step up to the plate and catch something. On this slide, for example, you can see that PowerShell is actually integrated with Defender. I was creating a script that was designed to mimic viral activity because I was doing a session on PowerShell security a while back. And in the course of writing this PowerShell code, Defender actually stepped in and said, hey, this might be a malicious script. You may not want to run this. So you can see that Defender does do something. Also, a while back, I ended up running a full-blown Defender scan on one of my network shares. And this has been several years ago, but when I did that, it ended up finding a piece of malware that had lied dormant on a file server for 17 years. I'm talking about something that none of my other anti-malware software had caught, and yet, for whatever reason, Defender ended up catching it. So Defender does have its place, and I would recommend not disabling it. Now, I talked a little bit about passwords earlier and how you should transition toward not using passwords if at all possible. But the reality is that, at least for right now, passwords are here to stay. I think we will, within the next few years, maybe a little longer than a few years, but we will eventually hit the point where passwords become a thing of the past. But for right now, they are something that we have to deal with. So it's important to consider password best practices. Because remember what I said earlier. Identity is the new perimeter. You want to defend your Active Directory, you defend identities. And a big part of defending identities is password management. So one of the big things that has come out, and it's somewhat controversial, but NIST, Microsoft, and some of the other security agencies are now recommending against not expiring passwords automatically. They're saying that there's no reason to make a user change their password every month or every 2 months or whatever, just for the sake of changing the password. It's a lot better to just use a really long, complicated password, and unless that password's been compromised, there's no reason to change it. Now, that doesn't work in every situation because organizations in regulated industries have to consider what the regulations say. One of the regulations, I believe it's HIPAA, requires changing your password every 60 days. So in a situation like that, you would have to do what the regulation dictates rather than password best practices. But for everybody else, it's important to acknowledge the idea that password best practices do evolve over time, and that you should periodically review what NIST and Microsoft and others are advising. So here are the latest NIST guidelines as of November 2021. According to NIST, password length is a lot more important than complexity. They also recommend against enforcing regular password resets just for the sake of resetting your password. They also recommend that you screen all new passwords against a list of commonly used and compromised passwords. So why is this important? Well, imagine for a moment that an attacker goes after a large organization and they harvest credentials from that organization. The benefit of those harvested credentials go beyond those specific accounts that were compromised. Let's say they harvest the password. What they would do is separate that password from the account that it goes with, and then they would perform a hash of that password and then add that password hash to a database along with the password itself. So then, if the attacker later attempts to infiltrate another organization and they get a hold of a list of hash credentials, rather than having to do a brute force crack of all of those credentials, they take those hashes and compare it against the database and see if there were any hits. So if a password that somebody is using has been previously compromised, even in a different organization by a different user, then the hash of that password is likely going to be in a database, making it really easy to decipher that password. So it's really important to avoid using passwords that are known to have been compromised. So there are a number of third-party tools that will allow you to check user passwords against passwords that are known to be compromised. And I'm pretty sure that there is also a mechanism within Azure AD that will allow you to do that as well. Another NIST recommendation is to allow pasting of passwords. Some organizations disable copying and pasting of passwords because they think that it makes it more secure. And in some environments it might, but if a user has a really long, complicated password, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and allow them to copy and paste that if necessary, just because that kind of discourages writing down or just a lot of tedious typing. Also, give the user the option of showing the password as they type it. You know, certainly that shouldn't be the default behavior, but at least give the user that option, because if the user is able to, or let me rephrase that, if the user is having a little bit of trouble entering the password correctly, if they're able to enable that option to show the password, then maybe they can see where they're mistyping something and they can avoid an account lockout. Which brings me to the next best practice. Limit the number of failed password attempts before the lockout, and then from there, implement two-factor authentication. So we're starting to see a trend, multi-factor authentication for practically everything, and then salt and hash the passwords. So another best practice is turn on sign-in risk policy. The idea here being that conditional access policies can be used to assess sign-in risk. So if you have an Azure AD Premium subscription, you should turn on sign-in risk policy. I'll come back to this one in a little bit. And then another best practice is do not allow users to grant consent to unmanaged applications. This goes back to one of those things that I talked about earlier. If a user installs an application that's not sanctioned by the organization, there's always the chance that that application contains an exploitable vulnerability. Because remember, this isn't something the organization has approved, so they may not have taken the time to test this particular application. Or it's also possible that the reason they didn't approve it was because the application is known to be buggy or vulnerable or what have you. So it's a good idea to prevent users from installing applications that aren't sanctioned by the organization, because that can help prevent the user's account from being compromised. Because if a user installs that application, they generally, if they're installing it on a mobile device, have to grant consent for that application to perform various actions on the device. And the user may not fully understand or appreciate the implications of the application performing those actions. And remember, all it really takes is one bad click. So Azure Active Directory actually has a mechanism built in that you can use to prevent users from installing things that you didn't authorize. So here we are in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. And I've gone into the Manage section, and you can see that there's a setting called User Consent Settings. And when you select the setting, you see some descriptive text telling you that when end users and group owners are allowed to grant consent to applications and when they will be required to request administrative review and approval, Allowing users to grant apps access to data helps them acquire useful applications and to be productive, but can represent a risk in some situations if it's not monitored and controlled carefully. So then it goes on to say, configure whether users are allowed to consent for applications to access your organization's data. And we have three options here. Do not allow user consent, allow user consent for apps from verified publishers for selected permissions, and that's Microsoft's recommended action. And then the other option is allow user consent for apps. So then we also have the screen. There are two options I wanted to point out on here. One is users can add gallery apps to My Apps. You can set this to yes or to no to control what the users are able to do. And then the other thing is you can set it so that applications require administrative consent, and you can automatically expire those requests after a certain number of days if necessary. Now, another best practice with regard to Active Directory security is to designate a single Azure AD Directory as the authoritative source for corporate and organizational accounts. Now, why is this? Well, I'm not talking about multi-tenancy here. Multi-tenancy definitely has its place, and there are perfectly legitimate business use cases for that. So that's not at all what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is situations where organizations accidentally accumulate Azure AD footprints. So imagine, for example, that, 10 years ago, an organization decides to adopt Microsoft 365. So they break out the corporate credit card, they set up a Microsoft 365 subscription, and Microsoft 365 depends on Azure AD. So it comes with Azure AD baked into it. Then a couple years later, the organization decides, hey, I'm hearing an awful lot about this Azure cloud. Let's set up an Azure subscription. So they set up an Azure account, and then somewhere along the way, somebody sets up Active Directory in that Azure subscription. And maybe they even set up Azure AD Connect to synchronize the on-premises Active Directory up to Azure AD. Well, at that point, the organization has Active Directory resources on premises, they have it in Azure AD, and they have it in Microsoft 365. So we've got three separate Active Directory footprints. Now, in some ways, Azure AD and the on-premises Active Directory can be thought of as one because Azure AD Connect synchronizes accounts between the two. But that doesn't change the fact that you've got two separate Azure AD environments, one in Microsoft 365 and the other in Azure itself. Now, this is problematic primarily because it increases the footprint. You have an expanded attack surface because you've got two separate Active Directory environments in the Azure cloud, one in Microsoft 365, one in Azure itself. So it's a good idea to go ahead and try to consolidate that if at all possible. That could be really tedious to do. It could be a little messy. You might even break things along the way. But it may be a very worthwhile endeavor if you've got multiple Azure Active Directories out there servicing the same batch of users. It will shrink the potential attack surface, and it will make management easier down the road. So I just looked at the clock, and I want to be sure and save a little bit of time for questions here at the end. So I'm going to skip past some of these other best practices. There are two other things that I want to quickly talk about before we run out of time. One best practice is to leverage conditional access policies if you've got an Azure AD Premium subscription. And if you don't have an Azure AD Premium subscription, this may be a good reason to get one. Conditional access policies, if you're not familiar with them, are similar to if-then statements, and they can go a really, really long way toward improving your overall security, and they can also help you with your zero trust initiatives. Conditional access policies are kind of like if-then statements. Now, normally when a user logs in, they enter a password, and we have one if-then statement. If the password is correct, then give the user access to everything that they have access to. Conditional access policies are a more sophisticated version of that because they don't just look at whether or not the user logged in successfully. They take other considerations into account when deciding whether or not the user should be granted access to resources. It isn't enough just for the user to have logged in successfully and to have access to a particular resource, because it's not always desirable to give the user access to resources that they would ordinarily have access to. Let's say that a user goes in and they try to access a particular resource at 9 a.m. every Monday morning. That's a normal pattern of behavior, and there's probably no real risk there. If, on the other hand, that same user logs in at 3 o'clock in the morning from a rogue nation on the other side of the world when they were just in the office a few hours ago, that's probably a sign that someone's attacking your network, and it's not in your best interest to allow that user account to access that resource that they legitimately have access to. This is where conditional access policies come into play. Conditional access policies are like if-then statements. They look at various conditions and make a decision based on the conditions that are being evaluated. So what kind of conditions? Well, there's a long list, but here are a few of the more common ones. You can look at things like what groups that the user is a member of, what type of device the user is working from. So, for example, you might choose to allow a user to access a really sensitive resource if they're in the office working from a domain-joined corporate desktop, but not allow access if the user is sitting at home trying to access that resource from their iPhone. You can also look at the operating system version. If the user is working from a mobile device, you can check if that device has been jailbroken or not. You can look to see if the user is working from a device that's using a trusted IP address range. You can check the user's country or region and the data that's being accessed. So those are a few of the things that conditional access policies can look at when deciding whether or not to allow access to a particular resource. Now, the one other thing that I wanted to quickly talk about before we run out of time here is the 10 immutable laws of security. Now, I didn't make these up. There's a link at the bottom of the slide to a place where you can go and find these. But these are 10 philosophies that generally hold very, very true when it comes to securing the Active Directory or anything else that you may want to secure. So I thought that it might be a good use of time to just go ahead and go over a few of these. Law number 1, if a bad guy can persuade you to run his program on your computer, it's not solely your computer anymore. Some of these are hard truths, but they're sobering. They give you some things to think about. Law 2, if a bad guy can alter the operating system on your computer, it's not your computer anymore. Law 3, if a bad guy has unrestricted physical access to your computer, it's not your computer anymore. So these first 3 laws tend to pertain more to endpoints rather than Active Directory, but these are still important philosophies for security. Law 4, if you allow a bad guy to run active content in your website, it's not your website anymore. Law 5, weak passwords trump strong security. So again, here's that need for strong passwords, for following password best practices, and eventually moving beyond passwords to authentication systems that don't rely on passwords. Law 6, a computer is only as secure as the administrator is trustworthy. So that one is a good argument for delegation of permissions and using role-based access control. Law 7, encrypted data is only as secure as its decryption key. Law 8, an out-of-date anti-malware scanner is only marginally better than no scanner at all, so keep those malware or anti-malware applications up to date. Law 9, absolute anonymity isn't practically achievable online or offline. And Law 10, technology is not a panacea. So with that said, we've just got a couple of minutes left, and I want to go ahead and open it up for questions.
All right, thanks, Brian. We actually only have time for one question, so I will go as broad as possible. This question comes in from Lowell. Can everything ever be truly secure?
Absolutely not. There's always going to be some element of risk. One of the philosophies in security is that your security protocols also make you predictable. So if you adhere rigorously to the list of best practices and everybody knows you follow those best practices, well then the simple fact that you're following those best practices means the bad guys know how you're conducting your security operations, and they can develop countermeasures for those security protocols that you adhere to. So, you know, it's always a game of security measures and countermeasures. I don't think we'll ever achieve total security.
Okay, with that, we are out of time. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you for having me.